Hey there, everybody. Do not adjust your computer. I'm supposed to be a very tiny picture in the middle of it, and you'll see why in a moment. But welcome to our first Revelation study online. Let me get right to it. Here's why I'm small and in the middle, but because I'm going to be down in the corner. And then what we're going to do is, as we go through this, we're going to show all of the notes on the main screen. I'm going to be down here in this tiny little corner with all of the notes over here. So let me walk you through what we're going to be doing through this entire series, how it's going to be laying out for us as best we can figure out while we're doing it. First of all, why are we doing a Bible study on Revelation? Because the world's coming to an end? No. No, the world's not coming to an end. We're in a crisis right now. For those of you who are watching it maybe months or years later, because this may stay up on YouTube a long time, we are doing this in the middle of the coronavirus crisis of 2020. So those of us who are stuck at home, which is everybody right now, we're trying to figure out ways to connect. And so one of the things I've been asking around is what would be a Bible study everybody would like. And by far the response I get back, not just in the middle of this coronavirus crisis, but at any time, the big answer I always get back is the book of Revelation. Everybody's really interested in this fascinating book. We usually don't have the time to do it. Now we have the time, but now we can't get everybody in the same room, but we can do it this way through video. So that's what we're doing. So that's the first thing. We're going to be doing the book of Revelation because it's been asked for so much. Also, I think it really is appropriate during a season like this because the book of Revelation was written to Christians during a season of great crisis. Their crisis was significantly bigger than ours is today. It was under the thumb of Roman persecution. It was at a time when they did not have the medicines or even the understanding of quarantine that we have today. And it was really a message of hope. Most of the time that I've seen the book of Revelation taught on in my lifetime, it has caused fear, which is exactly the opposite of what the book is supposed to do. It is written to Christians in crisis to alleviate our fear, to give us hope. In fact, that's what I'm calling it. This is the Bible's most hopeful book. That's really the subtitle of the study that we're going to be walking through. So this is not going to be about fear or fear mongering. I'm not going to tell you how this current crisis is found in the book of Revelation because it's not. Uh, we're not looking for signs of the times. We're not looking for if the world is coming to an end. We're going to walk through the book verse by verse and try to get as close as we can to how the first Christians who read this book would have read it verse by verse when they first got it, as close as we can. So this is not going to be a doom and gloom study. It's not going to be comparing it to current events. It will be an attempt to look at it in the best way possible, verse by verse, as the original readers read it. So here's how the study is going to go. We're going to put it out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, probably in the afternoon or evening on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday. If you want indications of when it's coming, here's when you can get your notifications. You can go to the church Cornerstone Facebook page. You can follow Cornerstone on Instagram. If you're not on either of those social media platforms, you can email me at karlvaters@cornerstonefv.com. I will put you on the email list, and every time we put a new video out, I will email you so you will know exactly when it is. This is not like our Sunday services where we're asking you to gather at 10 a.m. and watch it together. This is going to be put out. You can watch it at any time you want to. It's not necessarily a communal thing, although if you want to watch it with others that you know, feel free to do so. If you want to share it after watching it with others, do so. If you miss one or two episodes, you can go back and catch them because they will all be listed at the church website, cornerstonefv.com/Bible study. I will also be putting it on my own personal website, karlvaters.com/Bible study. So it'll be in all of those places and it'll stay there. So when I put it out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, it will be a different episode every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday as we go through the book. So normally we do this like a week at a time, every Monday or every Wednesday. But because we've got this extra time and people are looking for hope and looking for things to do and having the time to study the Bible, let's do 3 weeks worth per week. At this point, it'll take us, I don't know, a dozen to 20 episodes probably to do a decent job on Revelation, which means we're going to be doing this for 4 to 5 or maybe even 6 weeks. Hopefully, this entire crisis will be over by then, but we'll continue to put them out. If we start it, we will finish it. But if this does continue to go on that long, then we'll have something to do during that season. So that's the way it's going to go. Because this is pre-recorded, you will not be able to respond to this in real time. If you're watching on YouTube or even on another platform, potentially there may be ways to comment on it, so you can do that. Or again, you can email me and let me know if you have questions, anything you want to follow up on. I'd be happy to do so. Each session is probably going to last about half an hour to 45 minutes. Some may be a little longer, some may be a little shorter, but that's about the plan right now. 3 a week, half an hour to 45 minutes each. So when we're talking about the book, what are we talking about? Well, let's take a look at it this way. First of all, let me see. We'll change the heading. There we go. There we go. The book of Revelation means apocalypse. Actually, let me back up a second. Let's go to the first verse of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation begins this way: the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, before I actually do that, let me tell you, I'm not going to be putting the verses up on the screen. There's way too much of that. And what I want you to do is I actually want you to get out your Bible, get out a notebook, and actually physically look at it in your Bible, whether it's on your phone or in a physical print Bible. In fact, I really encourage you to have a physical print Bible in front of you. You can make notes on that better. It sticks in our memory better if we do that. So let's begin that way. The pace is going to be slow. We're probably only going to look at verse 1 today, and probably only the first 8 or 9 verses on Wednesday. And then the pace will pick up as we go through, because there's a lot of pre-explanation for it. So here we go. Revelation 1:1 begins with these words: the revelation of Jesus Christ. Most misreadings of the book of Revelation come from a misunderstanding of this. These 4 words, these first 5 words, the revelation of Jesus Christ, is actually the title of the book. The revelation of Jesus Christ. And we see a couple things from that. First of all, the word revelation in the original Greek, which is what the New Testament was written in, is the word apocalypse. So revelation from Greek literally means apocalypse. Now, here's our first misunderstanding that we have when we look at this book. We have come to see the word apocalypse as end of the world, right? Because, well, when we get to the book of Revelation, it will be the end of one world and the beginning of a new world. But that's not literally what the original word apocalypse means. The word apocalypse means to reveal. It means a revelation. It means an unveiling. It comes from 2 Greek words, apo and kalypsis, which together mean an unveiling. So that's what it is. So what is the first 5 words of the book, which is really the title of the book? It's the unveiling of Jesus Christ. So there are a couple things about that that are important. First of all, it's a revelation. It's not revelations. Now, I know at some point you're going to hear somebody call it the book of Revelations. At some point, you may call it the book of Revelations. If you do, I won't point and laugh. But the truth of the matter is, it's not the book of Revelations. There's not multiple revelations in it. There's one revelation in the book, and it reveals Jesus Christ. So here's the first kind of key to unlocking the book of Revelation. Everybody wants a key. We'll give you a couple, but they're not secret keys. They're pretty obvious keys. The first key to unlocking the book of Revelation is this: how does it reveal Jesus? If you're in the middle of the book of Revelation and you see some weird thing and you don't understand what it means, first thing you need to ask yourself is, what does this tell me about Jesus? Whenever you look to Jesus first, you cannot go wrong. Whenever you ask about Jesus first, you cannot go wrong. Whenever you ask, what does this book reveal to me about Jesus, you cannot go wrong. So that's the first thing you need to look at. It's one revelation, not multiple revelations, and it is a revelation of Jesus Christ. So the first 5 words of the book are critically important. We often just zip past that because we want to get to the weird stuff with the dragons and the trumpets and the seals and the end of time and heaven coming down and all that other stuff. And we'll get there, but let's not get there too fast. This entire book tells you what it's about. It is the revelation of Jesus Christ. In fact, what's really interesting about this book, as challenging as it is and as hard as it is to understand at times, Revelation in some ways is one of the most straightforward books in the entire Bible. For example, we know who wrote it, which we'll talk about probably on Wednesday. We know where the author was when he wrote the book. We know who it was written to. We know why it was written. We even know the day of the week it was written on. I mean, think about that. who it was written, who wrote it, when it was written, to the day, who it was written to, why it was written. We know all of that, and we'll see that as we go through. So when we look at the book of Revelation, people have a tendency to want to look at the weird stuff first. It's just a human tendency, I guess. We want to see what's strange first. But when you do that, you then are starting with the obscure, and you'll never get to clarity if you start with things that are obscure. So what we're going to do through this is, first of all, go verse by verse. But secondly, we're going to look for the obvious truths first. And then let's frame the weird stuff around what's not weird. So what's not weird? That it is a revelation. It is a book designed to reveal, to unveil Jesus to us. So everything we do is going to be, where do we see Jesus in this? When you start with that, even the weird stuff starts to make a little more sense. Now, if this is simply a book to reveal Jesus to us, that's kind of what the Gospels do already. And the Gospels do it in a much more straightforward way. It's just, here's what Jesus did. Here's what Jesus said. Here's how Jesus behaved. It's much clearer. Why is Revelation, well, let's just call it that. Why is Revelation so weird? Okay, here's why. Revelation was written, let me see if we got it here. There we go. Revelation is written in what is called the apocalyptic style of literature. One of the things that you know at Cornerstone, every time I talk to you almost, I tell you, I remind you that when you open the library, when you open the Bible, you're not looking at a book, you are walking into a library. And in the library that we call the Bible, this group of 66 books, there are different kinds of books. And if you were to physically walk into a library today, you can't because they're all closed right now, but you get the idea. If you were to physically walk into a library today, we would have a really clear understanding when we walk into the kids section, or when we walk into the fiction section, or when we walk into the science section, or when we walk into the biography section, right? We know that when we're physically in a library. We lose that sense when we open up a single book where an entire library has been put together. But that's what we need to imagine when we're looking at the Bible. When we walk into the Bible, we're walking into a library, and the Bible has bibliography. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the bibliographies of Jesus. The Bible has books of poetry. Psalms and Proverbs are books of poetry. The Bible has books of prophecy, preaching, which are most of the books at the end of the Old Testament, for instance. The library of the Bible has a bunch of letters, which is what most of the last half of the New Testament is, including the book of Revelation. And the Bible also has a handful of books written in this particular style of literature called apocalyptic. Now, there's the word, apocalyptic is a term for a particular style of writing that was very popular. It started during the Babylonian captivity, so just about 100 years or so before the Old Testament closes, when the Jewish people are taken into captivity in Babylon. Boy, my voice is just not working today. When they're taken into captivity in Babylon, when the Hebrew people want to communicate with each other, including about things like, how do we get free from the Babylonians, or how do we, overturn the Babylonian Empire? You can't just write that where the Babylonians can read it. So what they did was they devised a literary code called apocalyptic, and that's what apocalyptic literature is. It is a literary code that is specifically designed so that the people who know the code can speak to each other, and the people who don't know the code can't read it. It's similar to, if you've seen any of the movies about breaking the Enigma code, for instance, through World War II, right? When people are at war, those who are together come up with a code, and the other side tries to break that code so they can hear what's being communicated. That's what Revelation is. Revelation is written in a code language called apocalyptic literature, so that the Jewish people could understand what was being said between each other, but their captors, the Babylonians when it began, and the Romans by the time we get to the book of Revelation, so that their captors, so that their overseers, so that the people who were in charge of them could not understand what was going on, so that these people who were under the thumb, first of all, of the Babylonians, then or the Assyrians, and the Babylonians and the Romans, these people who had them under their thumb couldn't understand what they were saying to each other. So that's why it's weird. That's also why a lot of people talk about having to have a key to unlock the book of Revelation, because if it's written in a code, you have to know the key to unlock the code. right? That's what you have to do. So, what is the code to unlock revelation? This is the first place where most people really get in trouble. Because if somebody's trying to sell you a book or somebody's trying to get you all hyped up so they can sell you end of the world products, thousands of pounds of food so that you can store it in your garage or whatever. If they're trying to hype you or they're trying to sell you, then they've got to come up with a code that you can only get from them. But I'm going to give you the actual code that the Bible itself uses, and there's no product to go with it. So you might have an idea that, hey, this is actually the sincere way to do it. And here's where it is. The key to cracking the book of the mystery of Revelation, here's the key. Ready for the key? Here it is. You got to know the basics in Genesis through Jude. That's it. So here's the code that the Jewish people used to speak to each other under Babylonian captivity and by the time Revelation is written under Roman captivity. The Jewish people knew the Old Testament. They knew it really, really well. It was their history book. It was their law book. It was their religious book. It was their philosophy book. It was the book, the library that they walked into to identify themselves as Jewish, to understand how to behave. It was the invisible language that they used between each other. There were expressions of speech that Hebrews used between each other out of the Old Testament that a Roman would sit there and scratch their heads and go, I have no idea what they're talking about, because it was just language that they used. So they realized, hey, the Romans haven't taken the time to read the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, what the Hebrews at the time simply called their Bible or the law. They haven't taken the time to read this. So if we continue to talk in Old Testament, in Bible metaphors, then they won't be able to understand what we're talking about. So that's what apocalyptic literature did. Apocalyptic literature uses the rest of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and uses expressions that would have been familiar from one Jew to the other to be able to talk about things back and forth with each other. So if you want to know Revelation well, get to know the rest of the Bible well. That's the key. It's not some weird little secret. It's not something strange that I can that I have to sell you something on or whatever. It's just the basics. The better you know the rest of the Bible, then you'll read Revelation and you'll go, oh, I recognize that from such and such. And then you go back to Ezekiel, or you go back to Daniel, or you go back to Genesis, and you see what it means there. And then you go, oh, that explains what he's talking about in Revelation. So we'll do that a lot through this series. We will go through the rest of the Bible, because the book of Revelation refers to the rest of Scripture constantly. That is the code that's used. Almost all of the images in Revelation, almost all of the numbers in Revelation, almost all of them are drawn from the rest of Scripture, especially the Old Testament, and especially the tabernacle. So we'll talk about the tabernacle in the wilderness a lot. Now, one last thing on the word revelation before we move past the first 5 words of the book. It is the unveiling of Jesus and not the veiling of Jesus. So pause for a moment and think that through. This is not meant to put a veil on Jesus. This is meant to reveal Jesus. It's meant to remove the veil from Jesus. Okay? So the purpose of Revelation is to reveal Jesus to us, which we've already talked about, but we need to remind ourselves again. Now, one more thing that we need to understand about this is when it says it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, the word Christ is an interesting term especially when we add it to the word Jesus. Christ is not Jesus' last name. Christ is a word that means Messiah or deliverer. So when it says it's the revelation of Jesus Christ, what it means is this is the revelation of Jesus, the deliverer, Jesus, the Messiah. So specifically what we're looking for when we're seeing Jesus in Revelation, we are looking for Jesus in his identity as deliverer, as the one who brings hope to the wounded, as the one who recovers sight to the blind, as the one who brings freedom to the captive, as the one who brings hope to the people who are in despair. He will deliver us from whatever difficulty that we're in. So the purpose of Revelation is to reveal Jesus to us, but specifically Jesus, the Christ, the deliverer. Now, why do we have to use code for that? Here's why. Because calling Jesus the Christ was treason against Rome. Think about it. If you're a Jew and you are following a rabbi named Jesus, and Jesus is going around, this rabbi is going around calling himself Jesus the deliverer. Well, deliverer from who? There's only one people to be delivered from in that era, and that was the Romans, and they're listening to everything. So you cannot call Jesus the deliverer or the Messiah without getting in trouble. So that's another reason for using the code, because the whole book is about how God's people are going to be delivered from those who are against God and against his purposes for us. So apocalyptic code was needed because calling Jesus the Christ was treason against Rome, and it was treason that was sentenced to death. And indeed, a lot of first and second century Christians were killed for their faith, for believing in Jesus as the Messiah, as the deliverer from Rome. Now, why was there no code used earlier in the Bible? In fact, there was. You can see some of apocalyptic language in Joel, in Zechariah, in Isaiah, but especially in the last half of the book of Daniel, Daniel 7 through 12, you see almost all of that, the image of gold and all of those strange and interesting kind of dreamlike sequences. If you're not sure if it's apocalyptic, when you read it, you go, it seems like I'm reading about somebody's weird fever dream. That's apocalyptic. That's typically where it is. There is no apocalyptic code used in the writing of the Gospels or in the other letters. And the reason for that is those were written much earlier than the book of Revelation, and the persecution against the church was not as severe back then as it was by the time the book of Revelation was written. So apocalyptic is always written during times of crisis for Christians and of persecution for Christians. And so this is one of those. So in fact, if you look at the life of Jesus, you will see at the beginning of his ministry, he didn't tell that many parables. By the end of his ministry, he told a ton of parables. And to the point where the disciples even asked, why are you talking in so many parables right now? And Jesus told them this. In Luke 8:10, Jesus said this, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to others I speak in parables, so that though seeing they may not see, though hearing they may not understand. So at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he just told them stuff straightforward. There was nobody else listening, nobody else paying attention. Closer to the end of his ministry, as the Romans were now listening and going, oh, this guy could be trouble, and as the Pharisees were listening and going, oh, this guy could be trouble, Jesus started speaking more in secret language. He started using parables. So this idea of using parable or using code to speak to each other in times of crisis is something that Jews and Christians have done throughout all of history, and Revelation is simply the most obvious example of that. So, for instance, during the time that Revelation was written, Caesar had recently declared that he was a god, and that if you did not worship Caesar as a god, you could be thrown in jail or you could potentially be killed. And of all the people in the Roman Empire, the only people who routinely would not worship Caesar as God were Jews and Christians. Everybody else was pagan. Everybody else was an idol worshiper. If Caesar wants to be worshipped as God, no big deal. We just add one more idol to the idol shelf. Literally, you go out and buy an idol to Caesar. You put it next to all your other idols. Fine, we've got an idol on the shelf. We're worshiping Caesar. Big deal. That's about all it meant to them. Only Jews and Christians routinely went, no. There is one true God. He actually exists, and we're only going to worship him. So that's why even as you read the book of Revelation, you're going to see things like Jesus being called King of Kings and Lord of Lords. When you read that, that is a deliberate slap in Caesar's face. Jesus is not just a God to add to the shelf. He is the God. So all of that to say this. If you have read through the book of Revelation before and you have had a hard time figuring out what in the world it means, you're not stupid. Okay, it's a hard book. It was written in Greek. It was written 2,000 years ago. It was written on the other side of the world. And it was specifically written using a code designed to hide its meaning from 90% of the population. So we can get through to the code because we have the rest of the Bible with us. We have Genesis through Jude with us, and we can go back and we can reference it, and that's what we're going to do. So that's the title of the book. Let's now finally move on to the subtitle of the book, still in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, which says this. The subtitle, The Revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. So, this is a revelation of Jesus Christ. And where did we get it from? It's what God, the Father, gave the Son, Jesus, as a message for us, his servants, about Jesus. Got that? From God through Jesus to his servants about Jesus. And it's about what must soon take place. So there is a future aspect to the book of Revelation. Again, before we get to all the mysteries and all the weirdness in Revelation, let's take a look at some of the basics. From God to Jesus, about Jesus, for us, about things to happen in the future. But here's the next question. Does it mean future events from when he wrote it 2,000 years ago, or does it mean future events still to us 2,000 years later? This is by far the place of the biggest disagreement among believers and biblical scholars about the book of Revelation. Is it about stuff that's already taken place but was in the future for them when they wrote it? Is it about things that are still in the future for us now? And my approach is this. Has it happened or is it still to come? My answer is this. Yes. Some things have obviously already taken place. Next chapter, which we'll probably get to next week. For instance, you're going to see the prophecies to 7 New Testament churches. Those prophecies to those specific churches about their specific situations 2,000 years ago were in the future for them, but are in the past for us. Those things have already happened in those churches. There's also stuff going to be happening in Revelation 12 that describes a war in heaven and about the casting out of the angels, which happened, quite frankly, before Genesis 1:1. So there are portions of Revelation that to the writer in the first century AD, to the writer was way in the past. The war in the heavens that happened before Genesis 1:1. It was about events that were happening then at that time in 7 different churches and 7 specific situations in Revelation 2, which we'll get in a few sessions from now, about what was actually happening then. And it was about things still to come in the future, a new heaven and a new earth, and so on. So reading Revelation is like watching one of those movies with a fractured timeline. Or if you're a fan of This Is Us, right? How many times has This Is Us, the television show, fooled us? We think we're watching today and then we go, oh no, it was way in the past, or oh no, it's way in the future, right? They love doing that. They love playing with the timeline. Well, reading the book of Revelation is like that. And let's be honest about it. Not everybody agrees about the timeline. And you know what? That's okay. If you disagree about the timeline from me, that doesn't make you a bad Christian. That doesn't make me a bad Christian. As long as we are seeing a hopeful message and we're seeing Jesus unveiled through it, that's okay. I actually don't think Revelation is primarily about the timeline. And you know why? Because there's no timeline in it. There's a lot of people who have found, kind of time structure in it and have put together their own timelines. Almost everybody disagrees about the timeline. And I think if the timeline was what it was about, God's smart enough to put a timeline in it if that was the issue. But that's not the issue. There's no timeline in it because it's not about the timeline. It is about unveiling Jesus Christ as the deliverer of anybody who's under oppression in the immediate and ultimately when we all get to heaven. It addresses both of those issues. So far we know this for sure, and we're about to conclude this session together. This book is a message from God to us through Jesus, about the past, about the present, and about the future. Yeah, okay, I think that covers all of it. Now you know why it's so confusing. It's about a whole lot of stuff. So while the Gospels show us Jesus in past history, Revelation shows us Jesus in future history. And I know the phrase future history is an odd phrase. How can you have future history? But it can because of this. God created all things. And when he created all things, I mean all things, including space and time itself. So the God who created space lives outside of space. The God who created time lives outside of time. This is where our heads are going to start to hurt, but go with me here. The closest analogy that I can imagine to help me bend my mind around it even a tiny little bit is this. I try to imagine Jesus as the author of a book or as the director of a movie. When a person writes a book, and I've written 3, so I have some experience in this, almost nobody writes a book from first word to last word the way we read it. When I write a book, some of the first parts are in chapter 12 and some of the last parts end up in chapter 1. They end up in all kinds of different spots. Shooting a movie the same way. Movies are very seldom shot in sequence. They're often shot, later parts early, earlier parts later, bits and pieces in later because you forgot about it or you had to change the way the narrative went. They're shot in bits and pieces. And before the movie actually plays in front of an audience or before the book is actually read by a reader, it's all over the place. So I want you to imagine that God, the creator of this movie that we are now living through or this book that we are now living through, he exists above and outside the pages of the book and above and outside the running of that film. So while this film is now underway, and he's not going to be like George Lucas and go back in and change his movie, okay? That was a Star Wars reference for those of you who are geeks. He's not going to change it. The past is the past. That's what it is. Before the past happened, and before the future, which we have yet to live, happened, God knew what it was because he put the whole book together, right? Maybe even a better analogy than that would be a reality series. Because within a reality series, while there is some scripting and there is some editing, there is the expectation, at least, that within a reality series, people are actually behaving with some type of free will. And we won't even get into the whole God's choice of free will thing. That's another part of it entirely. But nevertheless, the picture is this: God oversees all of it, and God even lives outside of time, which means when we're looking at Revelation, we are not just looking at things that have yet to take place. We are looking at things that have yet to take place, but have already been seen by God, even though they haven't been lived out by us yet. Again, I know that starts hurting our heads, but that's the way it is. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because this is not something we hope will take place. This is not something that God is trying to make take place. This is something that God has already seen take place in the movie that is his movie, in the book that is his book. We simply haven't lived to that point yet. There aren't people out there actually living it. It hasn't literally happened yet. We are at this point in history, and there is no future point in history until it actually occurs. But to God, outside of all of that, he has seen it all. And he has given us in this book a picture so that we can have an understanding. Whatever our crisis is, whatever our difficulty is, whatever our feelings of hopelessness may be, this season is temporary. This entire existence that we know is temporary. And there is a better season coming and a better existence coming. And it's not hoped for, it's not probable, it's not something that God is trying to work out. It is something that God has already seen. It is future, but it's future history. And guess who's going to be in charge of all of it? Jesus. Just like he's the architect of creation, he's the architect of the end of all things. That's why the Bible talks about him being the Alpha and the Omega. Alpha, the first letter of the Greek alphabet; Omega, the last letter of the Greek alphabet. Jesus is in charge of it all. So, how is this message going to get to us? How is the rest of the book going to go? Well, we're going to get to the rest of verse 1. And finally on to verse 2, and probably all the way to the end of verse 8 in our next session together. So come back again on Wednesday, or if you're watching this much later, just go ahead and click on the next video on verses 1 through 8. I know, just a few words today, not even through a full verse. Trust me, it'll start going much faster as you go along. Hope you stick with us and hope you're getting a lot of hopefulness out of it. See you later, guys.